I'm Victoria Jensen, 36, a self made tech entrepreneur with a net worth of $500 million. Some people say betrayal feels like a knife, but for me, it felt more like ice slow, creeping, numbing everything until I couldn't tell what part of me was broken and what part was just gone. But that's not how my story started. It began with ambition, not dreams. I didn't have the luxury of daydreams as a kid in a Minneapolis middle class household. My parents were teachers, honest, exhausted, overworked people who loved with structure instead of extravagance. What they lacked in money, they made up for with belief in me. Especially, my father had this saying: your mind is the one asset no one can take from you. At the time, I didn't realize he meant that literally, while other girls wallpapered their rooms with boy bands. Mine was a circuit board graveyard. I wasn't trying to be different. I was different. I felt safer with algorithms than with people. Computers were honest. People were unpredictable. By the time I hit MIT, I'd stopped trying to fit in entirely. I earned dual degrees in computer science and business. Rarely dated, rarely partied. I didn't want to blend in. I wanted to build something no one could dismantle. Secure Nova was that thing. My fortress. My rebellion against every no I ever heard from a room full of men in suits pretending not to see me. My parents took out part of their retirement to fund it. I remember the shaking in my mother's voice when she said, "Only if you're absolutely sure." Victoria, I was, not because I believed I would succeed, but because I had no alternative. The first 3 years nearly broke me. 18-hour days, ramen for every meal, countless rejections, men who smiled at my pitch, then asked to speak to someone in charge. I was the CEO, the founder, and the lead developer, but to them, I was just a girl with code and confidence, both of which made them uncomfortable. Then came the breach. A top 5 global bank. Billions lost. I had spent months, years trying to convince them it would happen. When it did, Secure Nova became their salvation. Within a year, we had hundreds of employees, and my company valuation shot past $500 million. That's when I started believing I might actually be safe. Not just financially, but emotionally. Like I'd built something strong enough that I could finally let someone in. Ryan walked into my life with that exact timing. At a charity gala, one of those events where everyone's either pitching a startup or pretending to care about whatever cause is trending. That quarter, he wasn't selling anything. He was listening. Genuinely, or so it seemed. He asked about my security protocols, like he actually understood them. Said he was a corporate attorney, but didn't flaunt it. The way he looked at me, it was like he saw the woman behind the empire. The real me. For the first time, I thought, maybe someone can love me without needing to be intimidated or impressed. 6 months later, we were engaged. Helicopter proposal over Manhattan. I told myself it was romantic. Now, I wonder if he chose it because it made the right impression. Just enough spectacle to feel genuine. Looking back, I realize I wasn't falling in love with Ryan. I was falling in love with the idea of not having to defend myself anymore, of someone protecting me for once. But here's the truth. I wouldn't admit back then. I wanted to believe the lie. I needed to believe it. After all, what's the point of building an empire if you can't share it with someone? I didn't know it yet, but I had already been outmaneuvered. The years that followed were, by all outward appearances, perfect. Ryan and I had what people called a power couple dynamic. The tech visionary, him. The suave legal mind. He helped me breathe in rooms that always felt too thick with expectation. His social ease smoothed the sharp edges I'd spent years building. People adored him. They said I was lucky. I began to believe them. Our home in the Connecticut countryside was every inch a curated dream. Glass, stone, steel, a fortress, and a sanctuary. We held fundraisers for causes I cared about and mingled with the kinds of people who smiled too wide and asked too many questions about my company. But Ryan, he made it feel like none of that mattered. He'd whisper, "Ignore them." And I did. I trusted him to guard the parts of myself I kept hidden from the world. In hindsight, there were cracks, not fissures, just tiny, almost imperceptible seams in the image. His obsession with our net worth, his insistence on tracking which properties were under whose name, the way he pored over financial news about my sector, not with curiosity, but with calculation. At the time, I chalked it up to professional habit. After all, divorce law was his specialty. He'd seen the worst in people. Maybe he was just cautious. Maybe he admired how I protected what I'd built. Or maybe I was just good at rationalizing what I didn't want to see. The emotional distance grew so slowly, I almost didn't notice. Missed calls, canceled dinners, the subtle shift from shared laughter to polite silence. I convinced myself it was a phase, that high-profile marriages went through this. I even blamed myself. Maybe I worked too much. Maybe I didn't give him enough attention. I planned getaways, booked couples therapy, offered every olive branch I could think of. He always smiled, said it was just work stress. The Williams case is killing me, he'd say. Things will go back to normal soon. And I believed him. Because believing otherwise meant confronting the terrifying thought that I'd opened the gates of my carefully built kingdom to someone who never truly loved me. When our 10th anniversary approached, I saw it as an opportunity, a way to reset. I planned everything down to the hour: flights, private dinners, sentimental gifts. I told myself this trip would be our reawakening. That illusion lasted until I opened his laptop. He'd left it on. A rare oversight. The swirling screensaver us in Paris, us in Bali, us smiling felt like a mockery. I almost walked away, but then I saw the subject line. Offshore asset search. Jensen Holdings. It was the kind of phrase I couldn't ignore. My hands moved before my ethics could intervene. The emails, they weren't just disloyal. They were surgical, cold, detailed. Correspondence with private investigators, asset mapping firms in the Caymans, even a legal memo about dividing business properties in high net worth divorces. And then came the file, divorce papers, already drafted, just waiting for a date, a quiet click of a signature. He had been planning to end our marriage, but not until he had traced every penny I had, every account, every vulnerability. Not until he had ensured he could take the maximum possible from me. It wasn't just betrayal. It was strategy. The physical pain came first. A dull pressure spreading through my ribs like something was trying to crawl out. I couldn't breathe. Not properly. Not with that file open. Not with those words on the screen. After the anniversary trip, paperwork ready to file once offshore search completes. It was the phrase that kept looping in my mind as I stumbled to the bathroom. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I just knelt there on the cold tiles, silent tears soaking into a towel that still smelled like him, like eucalyptus and aftershave. Rachel's name was the final blow, the assistant I had defended, the woman I had once complimented for her diligence. Her emails to Ryan were unguarded, mocking. She spoke about me like a bank account, a hurdle, a soon-to-be irrelevant obstacle. I read every line 3 times. Then I opened the draft divorce petition, saved neatly in a folder labeled Final Assets. He hadn't just lied. He hadn't just cheated. He had orchestrated a corporate heist wrapped in the pretense of marriage. And the part that gutted me most, he was going to tell me after the Maldives trip. Not before, not with dignity, but on an island, far from legal counsel, far from home, like I was a business deal to be closed in a jurisdiction without complications. I don't remember falling asleep, only waking up with my cheek against the marble floor, a headache pounding from dehydration and betrayal. When I finally stood, something had shifted. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was quiet, cold, like the click of a safe locking shut. I walked through the house like a stranger, the photo of us in Florence, his cufflinks on the nightstand, our wedding china, still perfect in its display case. I touched them all. I forced myself to, because I needed to feel it. Every moment that had been poisoned, every lie I'd bought wholesale. By morning, the woman who had planned an anniversary surprise was gone. What rose in her place was someone Ryan had never truly met. He thought he knew me. Thought? Because I had opened my heart. I had let go of my mind. But I hadn't built a cybersecurity empire by being soft. No, I built it by spotting patterns, dissecting threats, anticipating betrayal. He'd underestimated me. I picked up my phone and called Marcus. 3 rings. Marcus, I need you. Not at the office. And tell no one. He didn't ask questions. He never did. We'd grown up together. He was the one person I knew had no angle, no secret ledger calculating how much I was worth. We met that afternoon in a cafe I hadn't visited in years, one Ryan wouldn't think to trace. Marcus arrived, looking concerned but calm. As I walked him through everything, every email, every file, his face hardened. I never trusted him, he said. But even I didn't think he'd go this far. Neither did I. I expected him to say something reassuring. Instead, he told me something worse. 3 months ago, he was asking about your Cayman accounts. Through back channels, the air around us seemed to thicken. He told someone he was helping you with international tax strategy. I assumed it was above board. It wasn't, and I knew it. There was more. Marcus said our internal security team had flagged strange access attempts on my email. The IP address from inside my home, my laptop, my phone. They'd quietly replaced both, citing system upgrades. You were being watched, he said, and we didn't want to scare you without proof. I looked at my reflection in the cafe window, barely recognizing myself. I had built an empire on anticipating digital threats, but I had let one sleep beside me for 10 years. Now the question wasn't whether I would protect myself. It was how quietly I could dismantle everything Ryan thought he understood. I didn't cry again after that meeting. Whatever grief had wrung me dry in the bathroom had given way to a sharper, more functional instinct. Survival. But not just that, something colder. Cleaner. Retribution. We moved fast. That same evening, Marcus and I met in a discreet legal office 2 towns over. No company logos, no receptionist chatter. Just blank walls, sealed doors, and the kind of silence that absorbs secrets. By nightfall, and we had assembled the core of what would become my war council. Patricia Winters, divorce attorney to the unforgiving and elite. She walked into the room with a folder already labeled Jensen ED. Jensen Cold Efficiency, dressed in charcoal silk. James Chen, my personal financial strategist since Secure Nova's earliest days. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was always to cut straight to the variables that mattered. And finally, Eliza Montgomery, my in-house digital forensics lead. Young, brilliant, unflinching. She didn't shake hands. She plugged in a secure drive and got to work. Every face in that room had seen the outline of my betrayal. None flinched. I needed that. I didn't need sympathy. I needed strategy. We'll start with asset tracing, James said, flipping through a binder of my portfolio. your Singapore division. How soon can we advance that timeline? 3 weeks, I said. Make it 5 days. Patricia was already making notes. Connecticut's equitable distribution rules don't work in his favor if you can prove these assets were segregated prior to marriage. Anything commingled is vulnerable. Anything documented as separate, especially international holdings, gives us leverage. Eliza barely looked up. Your home network was compromised. She confirmed. Your devices keylogged, monitored. He knew what you were doing before you did. I closed my eyes, exhaled. I had known it in my gut, but hearing it aloud. And now, we've cleaned your work devices, but we leave the home systems as they are. Feed him exactly what he wants to see. That was the beginning of the game. Misdirection. We created two realities, one that Ryan thought he was watching, and one he couldn't touch. On the compromised devices, I acted like everything was normal. Routine emails, meetings, anniversary plans. Behind the firewall, we orchestrated the strategic restructuring of a $2 billion business. By day 3, I was already running on caffeine and adrenaline. I barely slept, barely ate. My hands trembled sometimes, but never in front of them, not in front of the team. They had to believe I was still the woman who built Secure Nova out of a garage and alone. I was. But now, the stakes were personal. On the 4th day, Eliza handed me a new phone. Secure, untraceable. Use this for all private communication, she said. Let your old phone stay compromised. It's feeding him exactly what we want. So I did. I took calls about our anniversary dinner on the bugged line. I even gushed about surprise reservations I hadn't made. I let him think I was still in love, still blind, still planning a future with him. And I watched as the predator circled closer, believing his prey unaware. That night, I stood at the window of our Connecticut home, holding a glass of wine I didn't drink. Ryan was due back in 48 hours. I imagined him walking in, sun-kissed from the Caymans, wearing that smug, soft smile he reserved for manipulating people gently. He would bring a trinket, perfume, maybe, a keepsake to placate my affection while sealing my financial fate. He didn't know the villa in the Maldives had already been flagged. He didn't know that Rachel had been tailed by our investigator, shopping for sundresses she'd never wear on my dime. He didn't know the walls had already closed around him. Because here's the thing, Ryan never understood. I don't react. I architect. And this time, I wasn't just defending my empire. I was using it as a weapon. Ryan returned home on a Tuesday morning, all smiles and bronzed charm. His arms around me, a perfumed gift bag in hand. I matched his energy with near flawless precision, laughed in the right places, tilted my head the way I used to when I adored him, back when I still believed in the illusion. He smelled like salt and sunscreen, like Rachel. We had 48 hours until our anniversary trip, the one he thought would mark the beginning of his new life. The last step in a plan he'd started long before I ever saw the first breadcrumb. But he didn't know I'd followed those crumbs into the heart of his betrayal and built an inferno around it. That night, he cooked dinner, Thai curry, too spicy for his taste. But my favorite? Another performance. Another well-rehearsed scene in the tragic comedy that was our final act. I played my part effortlessly. You seem relaxed, I said, sipping the wine he poured. Just glad to be home, he answered, hand brushing mine. This trip, it's going to be good for us. There it was, the last layer of farce. I nodded, gently, as if touched, as if moved by the idea of rekindling love in paradise. I wanted to scream in his face. I wanted to laugh. I did neither. Instead, I held his gaze and said, I'm looking forward to it. He went to bed early, I waited until I heard him snore before I retrieved the envelope I had kept hidden under the drawer liner in my private office. Inside was a single printed image, the reservation confirmation for the Maldives villa made under his name, with 2 guests, charged to one of my international business cards. It wasn't evidence for court. It wasn't leverage. It was a reminder that I would never again allow someone to build their future by gutting mine. The next morning, my attorney received confirmation that Ryan's team had finalized the divorce filing. They would deliver the papers Thursday evening, right before our supposed departure. Perfect. Let him believe he was making the first move. Let him hand me the spark that would set fire to everything he thought he'd controlled. Wednesday was my quiet day. I visited my company's New York office under the guise of investor meetings. In reality, I met with Marcus and Eliza in a secured offsite space. We reviewed the finalized restructuring. Singapore was operational, the IP under protective custody in Delaware, the physical and digital infrastructure separated from all marital ties. It was bulletproof. Any unexpected movement from Ryan's side? I asked. None, Eliza said. He's still making evening calls to his lawyer. We're monitoring all external traffic. Nothing we didn't anticipate. Rachel. She left the Cayman Sunday night. He booked her a separate flight. Of course he did. Wouldn't want her accidentally bumping into me at the terminal. Back at home, I played the doting wife, Ryan, now giddy with victory. Suggested a pre-anniversary dinner. Thursday night, I booked Le Marais. He said, just us, like old times. He was delivering the blow over foie gras and candlelight. Charming to the last. Perfect, I said. Inside, I was ice. Thursday arrived. I wore a silk dress he'd once said reminded him of our first date. My makeup, precise. My smile, glassy. At 5. Soinf. Just before our reservation, Ryan got the call. He stepped outside to take it, phone pressed to his ear, one hand tucked into his pocket, like a man holding secrets. I watched from the hallway, out of sight. I didn't need to hear the words. He was confirming the drop, finalizing the play. When he returned, face composed but distant, I asked, everything all right? He leaned down, kissed my cheek, and whispered, just some last-minute work. Let's enjoy the evening. We drove in silence, hand in hand. A scene straight from a magazine ad. Successful couple. Polished and composed. But I knew what was coming. I'd rehearsed for it. I had dressed for it. I was ready. Because unlike him, I didn't need to play pretend. I was already living the truth. The first time I saw the divorce papers, it was from a courier's hand, not Ryan's. They arrived the next morning, precisely at 8. Any, like a package from some sterile fulfillment center cold. Efficient. Transactional. I stood at the doorway in my robe, coffee cooling in my hand, and took the envelope with a small, confused frown for the sake of the security cameras. Ryan had made sure the surveillance was working, thinking it would verify my reaction. He wanted documentation of shock, vulnerability, and emotional surrender. He underestimated the precision with which I could perform grief. I walked to the kitchen, set the envelope on the marble island, and slowly peeled it open. I made a soft sound, part gasp, part exhale, and read the first paragraph as if my heart had just cracked. But it had not anymore. It had broken days ago. And in the breaking, it had hardened into something unshakable. Inside, the document claimed his entitlement, half of all marital assets, including a detailed stake in Secure Nova, based on what his attorney described as substantial indirect contributions. It was absurd. He hadn't built this company. He'd barely understood what we did. But he had bet on my silence, on my heartbreak, on the idea that I would be too stunned, too devastated. To respond, he was wrong. Ryan came home an hour later, briefcase in hand, expression carefully neutral. He was done pretending now. The performance had served its purpose. He thought he'd won. "We should talk," he said, as if he hadn't spent a year building the guillotine. I sat at the dining table, the divorce petition spread out like some grim exhibit. "I assume you've canceled the Maldives trip." He blinked. "Yes." I thought it would be unwise to continue with that, given the situation. "Of course." He lowered himself into the seat across from me. For a second, he hesitated, probably expecting tears, a breakdown, pleading. But I only looked at him, the way one might study a document for hidden clauses. "I'm sorry it came to this," he offered. His voice so measured, it felt like a script. "But I think it's for the best." I nodded slowly. "And this proposal," I gestured to the papers, "half of everything." He leaned forward. "Victoria, it's equitable. We built a life together. You can't deny that I've supported you. Emotionally, socially, in public." "Emotionally," I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Or strategically." He paused. "Not long, just enough." "Look, the last thing I want is for this to get ugly," he said, spreading his hands in the universal gesture of peace. "Let's resolve it cleanly, quickly. I have no desire to harm Secure Nova, but you already tried. I thought you just weren't good enough to succeed." "Of course," I replied calmly. "We'll need time to review this with my legal team." He smiled falsely warm, utterly convinced he still held the high ground. "Naturally, but I think we both know how these things go. The longer it drags on, the messier it gets." Messy was the last thing he wanted. Not with his career dangling by a thread. Not with Rachel gone silent. Not with whispers already starting in the legal circles he once ruled. He left the table feeling victorious, like a man who had just outmaneuvered his opponent. But Ryan hadn't seen the board shift beneath him. He didn't know that behind every move, every document, every delayed breath, I had already prepared the next 3 counter moves. He didn't know that the company he was trying to sink his claws into had been out of his reach long before he filed that petition. What he believed to be the opening salvo was actually the beginning of the end. By the time Ryan's legal team began the discovery process, my defenses had already calcified into a near impenetrable wall of documentation, corporate structure, and digital audit trails. From the outside, it all looked like standard business. Evolution. Methodical. Boring, even. But buried beneath the contracts and restructuring was a fortress built not just on paper, but on pain. Ryan's first misstep came on Monday morning. He received a call from his attorney while we were both seated in the living room, he on his laptop, me pretending to browse vacation options I'd never book. I watched him tense, then rise and disappear into the kitchen, lowering his voice, though he had to know I could still hear. "No, that's not possible. She had those accounts before we were married." "Are you sure?" His tone was threaded with disbelief. He returned a few minutes later, mask back in place, and told me he was going into the office. No kiss, no explanation, just a slammed door. By Tuesday, cracks were showing in his posture, shoulders hunched, movements abrupt. His phone calls to his legal team grew sharper, angrier. "I don't understand why we can't access the IP ownership docs." I overheard. "It's supposed to be marital property. She used our resources." That's where he'd hung his case. This warped logic that my success somehow belonged to him by proximity. That his mere presence entitled him to a share of my genius. That my 20-hour workdays, the sleepless nights refining code, the business risks I took before we even met, all of that had value only because he had been adjacent to it. On Wednesday, over a dinner so awkward it could have been choreographed, he looked up from his phone and asked casually, "What's secure, Nova, Singapore. Exactly. I didn't blink. Our Asia Pacific expansion. The board approved it months ago. He chewed slowly, then forced a smile. Interesting. I don't remember hearing about it. Really? It was in the newsletter. I sipped my wine. You used to read those. He didn't respond. That night, he stayed up pacing. He thought I didn't notice. But I heard him on the phone in the den, arguing with his forensic accountant. She moved everything. But how? The filings are all legit. Thursday brought more panic. My legal team received requests for supplemental documentation. Clearly, a last-ditch effort to find loopholes or inconsistencies. We responded with precision. Meeting minutes, third-party audits, timeline memos. Nothing rushed. Everything predating his betrayal. And still, he clung to the illusion that he was in control. He took me to dinner that evening, hoping, I imagine, to gather information, to coax some admission or oversight. He had chosen my favorite restaurant, once a symbol of our courtship. Now, just another stage for manipulation. We barely spoke. He asked about how I was feeling, in that vaguely patronizing tone, like I was the fragile one, like I hadn't been out playing him every hour for the past 3 weeks. Then came Friday, a week since he'd filed, and the first visible cracks in his armor became public. His legal team met with mine, looking drawn, deflated. Patricia told me. Later, they'd expressed concerns about asset clarity and unexpected corporate insulation. Translation: they couldn't touch what they thought they owned. That night, Ryan confronted me. He came into the living room with a glass of scotch in hand. But he wasn't composed. Not this time. He looked disoriented, as if the ground had shifted beneath him and he couldn't find where to plant his feet. There's a discrepancy in the valuations, he said carefully. Something about the premarital nature of the IP. Interesting, I replied. I thought you were entitled to half of it. He studied me for a long time. You knew, he said finally, voice hollow. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The silence between us stretched, heavy with the weight of all the things we would never be able to pretend again. The house, the marriage, the facade of trust. It was all gone now. What remained was the aftermath, a battlefield of broken illusions, and 2 people still pretending to be civilized while the ruins burned around them. By Monday morning, the facade had shattered completely. Ryan's legal team, now splintered and increasingly erratic, had filed 3 motions in 48 hours, each more desperate than the last. First, they tried to subpoena internal documents from Secure Nova under the guise of marital transparency. Then they attempted to freeze one of the Singapore accounts, citing suspicious asset transfer timing. The third motion argued that my strategic filings constituted pre-divorce shielding and should be deemed fraudulent. All 3 were denied by noon. I watched Ryan unravel from across the breakfast table, each sip of his coffee more agitated than the last. His hands trembled slightly as he typed furious messages into his phone. He was still trying to salvage the story he had built for himself, that he was the victim of an unjust system, a loyal husband blindsided by a greedy wife. But the truth had begun to infect him like a slow, spreading fever. That afternoon, he cornered me in the hallway. Do you really think this changes anything? He snapped, eyes bloodshot. You can't hide everything. Eventually, the court will. I cut him off. Eventually, the court will see a man who tried to dismantle a marriage for profit and got outmaneuvered at every turn. You planned this, he hissed. You had everything ready. I let the accusation hang in the air. It wasn't entirely untrue. I hadn't started this war, but once it began, I had ensured I'd finish it. His next move was as pathetic as it was transparent. That night, he cooked dinner salmon with lemon dill sauce, my favorite. The man hadn't touched the stove in months. We ate in silence. Then he poured me a second glass of wine and launched into a monologue about second chances, about rebuilding. We were good once, he said. We could be good again. I stared at the man across from me, trying to summon some piece of the affection I once felt. But all I saw was strategy. A man trying to reel back what he thought he'd lost before the public fallout became irreversible. You want forgiveness because your plan failed, I said quietly. Not because you regret it. He didn't deny it. His silence was the loudest truth of all. The next morning, his threats resumed only now through legal channels. A new motion accused me of emotional manipulation, claiming I had used financial threats and public shaming to coerce a favorable settlement. The absurdity would have been laughable if it weren't so calculated. Patricia handled it with surgical precision. There is no coercion here, she told the judge. Only documented deception his. The judge didn't even request a response from our side. The motion was dismissed on arrival. By Wednesday, Ryan's allies were disappearing. Two of his firm's major clients dropped him. A scheduled speaking engagement was quietly canceled. Whispers of misconduct began surfacing in legal circles. People who once admired his finesse now viewed him as reckless. Compromised? I began receiving messages from mutual acquaintances, carefully worded texts expressing shock, concern, support. Some were genuine, most were positioning, even Rachel, the woman he'd planned to build his stolen empire. And white-hot anger felt only stillness. I didn't celebrate. There was no champagne, no victory dance, just a deep, cold recognition of what he had tried to take and the part of me that had been burned in the process. I had won the battle, but I hadn't emerged unscathed. What I had protected was irreplaceable, but what I had lost, that was still forming shape in the hollow behind my ribs. Trust, intimacy, the blind belief that love, when offered with open hands, would be held with care. By the end of the second week, the settlement negotiations became less about division and more about damage control for Ryan. He showed up to our third mediation session wearing the same suit from the day before. His voice, once smooth and assured, now cracked around the edges. He didn't look at me, not out of shame, I think, but because he knew that any eye contact might undo the performance he was barely holding together. His attorney, now clearly aware of the sinking ship beneath him, spoke in clipped phrases, offering terms that sounded more like concessions than negotiations. They no longer pressed for company equity. That fight was over. Their tone shifted less entitlement, more desperation to extract something before it all turned to dust. Patricia remained perfectly composed, offering slight nods and short replies, like a surgeon with no need to explain her precision. And I barely spoke at all. There was nothing left to say. My silence, I think, unnerved Ryan more than any confrontation would have. After the meeting, he trailed me to the elevator. Vic, he said, using the nickname he hadn't spoken in months. Can we talk? Just us. I turned to him. The hallway was quiet. The mediator's office behind us sealed shut. What else could you possibly have to say? I asked, not unkindly. I didn't want to hurt you, he said. All of this, it got out of control. No, I replied. It was always under your control. You planned it. You rehearsed it. You enjoyed it. His face twitched. I didn't think it would end like this. How did you think it would end? Ryan, I asked. You, on a beach in Maui with Rachel. My company gutted. My name tarnished. And me thanking you for your generosity. He tried to reach for my hand, but I stepped back, not out of fear, but because I finally understood that the man I had married wasn't a mystery. He was just a mirror. One I had been afraid to examine too closely. I left him standing there, still reaching, back at my apartment. The silence was no longer suffocating. It had become a kind of balm. No more performance, no more pretending, just the breath between each realization. The settlement was finalized 2 days later. Ryan retained his retirement accounts, his personal properties, and a few jointly purchased assets we both agreed to liquidate. Everything else, the company, the trusts, the intellectual property remained mine, not out of spite, but because it had never been his to begin with. Patricia handled the final signatures. When she slid the papers across the table to me, she said one word quietly under her breath. Done. Afterward, I sat alone in the conference room for several minutes, staring at the ink drawing on the divorce decree. The lines were just words, legalese, formalities, but they felt like a tombstone for a version of myself I no longer recognized. When I returned home, I opened the storage box I had packed the night I discovered his betrayal. Inside were all the things I didn't know if I'd ever want to see again. Our wedding photo, the anniversary card he once wrote in Florence, the journal entries from the first year we lived together. I added the settlement paperwork to the pile, not out of sentiment, but because I wanted the full story in one place. The dream and the disillusionment living side by side. That night, I slept without waking, no alarms in my chest, no phantom pain, just stillness. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was the absence of fear. And that was enough for now. 6 months later, I found myself standing in front of the glass wall of Secure Nova's newly expanded Singapore office, watching the lights of the harbor flicker across the water like signals from a distant life. I had just concluded a quarterly meeting with our board, and the revenue reports were stronger than projections proof, if any was needed, that the company had not only survived the storm. Ryan tried to engineer, but evolved from it. But I didn't feel triumphant. I felt hollow, not broken, not sad, just emptied, like someone who'd walked through fire, shed to their skin, and hadn't quite figured out what came next. The press continued to call me unshakable, the ice strategist, Silicon Valley's unburnable woman, and I let them. Public perception had always been its own kind of armor, but behind closed doors, with no boardroom to impress or enemies to anticipate, I was slowly learning how to feel again. Dr. Levine, my therapist, once told me that betrayal wasn't just an emotional wound. It was a kind of existential earthquake, a fracture in the trust we place in our own ability to discern truth from illusion. That's what took the longest to recover. Not just Ryan's betrayal, but the betrayal of my own instincts. Of all the moments I should have known and didn't, some nights, I still played back our old conversations, listening not for the lies, but for the silences, the spaces where his intent had lived, unspoken. That was where the real truth had always been hiding. Not in his words, but in what he didn't say. Still, in the absence of trust, I had rebuilt something else. Discernment. I no longer craved certainty from others, only consistency. I no longer mistook charisma for character, or silence for stability. I measured people differently now, not by what they promised, but by what they practiced. In many ways, I had become more isolated, but I had also become freer. I spoke at a conference 2 months after the divorce, standing on a stage before 300 women in tech, many of them first time founders, solo entrepreneurs, or underfunded visionaries still clawing their way into the room. I talked about systems, about security, about building walls that protected not just our data, but our dignity. Afterward, a young woman came up to me, tears in her eyes. My fiance asked me to merge my startup into his last month, she said. I told him no. Because of something you once wrote online, you saved me from something I didn't even know I needed saving from. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and held her hand. That night, I walked through Marina Bay alone, the humidity curling strands of my hair against my cheek. I passed couples on benches, mothers with children, a man playing violin under a dim street lamp. And for the first time in a long time, I felt no shame in walking alone. There was beauty in solitude, a different kind of intimacy in knowing that every step I took was mine, unshadowed by deception. As I returned to my hotel, I paused at the elevator and caught my reflection in the chrome doors. I looked older, not in a way I feared, but in a way that finally matched what I knew. The naive version of me who once believed that love and loyalty walked hand in hand was gone. But in her place stood someone better, someone who had faced the quiet horror of betrayal and not only survived, but turned it into a blueprint. Someone who now builds everything business, relationships, identity, not on promises, but on proof. And that quietly, fiercely is enough.